The click of the cabin door sealing was a sound Alastair Finch associated with absolute control. It was the sound of the world being shut out, of physics being bent to his will, of time itself becoming just another asset to be managed. His Gulfstream G800, a sleek silver dart against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, was more than a vehicle. It was his sanctuary, his boardroom, his kingdom at 45,000 feet. He loosened his tie, a silk blade of cobalt blue, and surveyed the cabin. Cream leather, polished burled walnut, a whisper-quiet climate system recycling air that was probably cleaner than any found in nature. Everything was in its place. Everything, except for the small, scuffed-up sneaker protruding from behind the single malts in the aft galley bar. Alistair froze. His world, so meticulously curated, so hermetically sealed, had been breached. This wasn't possible. His security team, led by the unflappable and terrifyingly efficient Mark, vetted every caterer, every fuel technician, every molecule of air that dared to approach his aircraft. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hand-stitched leather shoes making no sound on the thick, bone-colored carpet. He wasn't afraid. Fear was an inefficient emotion he'd long since divested from. He was analytically furious. This was a data anomaly, a system failure of the highest order. He reached the bar, the scent of expensive leather and lingering jet fuel filling his senses. He leaned over. Tucked into the small space between the mini-fridge and the bulkhead was a child. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with a wild mane of blonde, tangled hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was clutching a worn, faded blue backpack to her chest like a life raft, and staring right back at him with an unnerving, solemn intensity. "The seatbelt sign is on," Alistair said, his voice as crisp and cold as the air outside the triple-paned windows. It was the first thing that came to his mind, a ludicrously mundane observation in the face of such an impossible situation. The little girl didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her grip on the backpack and replied, her voice small but clear. "I'm not in a seat." The sheer, unassailable logic of her statement short-circuited a decade of Alastair's corporate negotiation tactics. He stood there, a titan of industry worth more than the GDP of several small nations, utterly silenced by a tiny stowaway who had somehow materialized in the heart of his fortress. The jet gave a slight lurch as it climbed, and for a dizzying moment, Alastair Finch had the distinct and terrifying sensation that he was no longer the one in control of the flight. He was just a passenger, rocketing into the unknown with this strange, silent child, who looked at him not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as if he were merely a temporary obstacle, a minor turbulence on her own, far more important journey. He pressed the intercom button, his thumb jabbing it with unnecessary force. "Mark," he barked, not taking his eyes off the girl. "Get up here, now. We have a breach." He expected his head of security to materialize instantly, to handle the situation with his usual brutal efficiency. But the girl just watched him, her gaze unwavering as if to say, "He can't help you." Alistair let his hand fall from the button. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the Rolls-Royce engines propelling them through the stratosphere at nearly the speed of sound. He was accustomed to orchestrating complex multi-billion-dollar mergers, to bending markets to his will, to knowing the answer before the question was even asked. But looking into the vast, oceanic eyes of this child, he found himself utterly, terrifyingly adrift. She was an unknown variable in his perfect equation, and her destination, he would soon discover, was a place that had been wiped off all his maps, a ghost address in a part of his soul he'd spent a lifetime and a fortune trying to demolish. The intercom crackled. "Sir?" Mark is in the cockpit for takeoff protocol. Is everything all right? It was Catherine, the senior flight attendant, her voice a smooth balm of professional calm. Everything is not all right, Catherine, Alistair said, his voice low and tight. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. We appear to have an unscheduled passenger. There was a beat of perfect, stunned silence on the other end. I don't understand, sir. Neither do I, Alistair admitted, the words feeling foreign and metallic in his mouth. He never admitted to not understanding something. Just stay there. I'll handle it. He ended the transmission and crouched down, wincing as the expensive fabric of his suit trousers pulled taut. He tried to soften his expression, to appear less like a predator, but his face felt like a mask he'd worn for too long, the muscles underneath having forgotten any other configuration. What is your name? The girl considered the question for a long moment, as if weighing its strategic value. Ilara, she said finally. Ilara, he repeated. The name meant nothing to him. And how, Ilara, did you get onto my airplane? She pointed a small, slightly grubby finger towards the forward cabin. The door. The man with the food boxes left it open. Just for a second. I'm very quiet. Alistair's mind raced. The caterers. A new company he was trying out, recommended for their Michelin star chef. A background check would have been run, of course, but a moment of human error. That's all it took. A single second of inattention to derail the most secure private travel on the planet. Mark would have someone's head for this. Several someones. Where are your parents? He asked, moving on to the next logical question. Ilara's gaze dropped for the first time, landing on the scuffed toes of her sneakers. My mom's waiting for me. Waiting for you? Where? In Zurich? That was his destination. A sterile city of bankers and secrets, where he was scheduled to close a deal that would reshape the European energy market. She shook her head, her dark hair swishing against the worn canvas of her backpack. No, not there. Then where? He pressed, his patience fraying into thin, sharp threads. This plane is going to Zurich. There are no other stops. Where is she waiting? Ilara looked up, her eyes locking back onto his. There was no fear in them, only a profound and heartbreaking certainty. She's at the place where you can see the stars best. Alistair stared at her. It was a child's answer, full of nonsense and poetry, utterly useless. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated frustration. He didn't have time for riddles. He had a timetable, a fiduciary duty to his shareholders. This child was a complication, a piece of grit in the gears of his perfectly calibrated machine. Listen to me, Ilara, he said, his voice losing any pretense of softness. You are on a private aircraft. That is a serious crime. When we land, you will be handed over to the authorities. They will find your parents. Now you are going to come out of there. You will sit in a seat, and you will not touch anything. Do you understand? For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Her small chin was set in a stubborn line. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she wriggled out from her hiding place and stood up. She was even smaller than he'd thought, a fragile-looking thing in jeans and a faded gray sweatshirt. She looked at the plush leather seats with a kind of detached curiosity, as if they were exhibits in a museum. She walked over to the seat opposite his and climbed onto it, her feet dangling a good 6 inches from the floor. She placed her precious backpack on her lap, wrapping her arms around it. Alistair straightened up and walked back to his own seat, the one that had been molded to the precise contours of his body. He sat down, the familiar comfort of it doing nothing to soothe the disquiet thrumming through him. He looked at the girl. She looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the deepening indigo of the sky, where the first stars were beginning to prick through the velvet darkness. He was trapped, miles above the earth, in a pressurized tube of his own making, with a ghost. A small, silent girl who smelled faintly of rain and attic dust, who was heading for a destination made of starlight. Catherine appeared at his elbow, her face a perfect mask of composure, though her eyes were wide with 1,000 questions. "Sir, can I get the young lady something? A juice? A warm blanket?" Alistair looked from Catherine's concerned face to Alara's still form. The girl hadn't even acknowledged their presence. She was lost in the cosmos beyond the window. "Get her whatever she wants," he said, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. "And get me a scotch. A double." As Catherine moved to attend to the girl, speaking in a low, gentle murmur, Alistair leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He tried to focus on the numbers, on the deal points, on the intricate dance of leverage and capital that he knew so well. But the numbers kept dissolving, replaced by the image of 2 stormy eyes and a nonsensical destination. The place where you can see the stars best. A bitter, unfamiliar taste rose in his throat. It was the taste of a memory, one he had buried under layers of concrete and steel. A memory of a different sky, a different life. A boy who had once known the names of the constellations. He opened his eyes and looked at the girl again. She had accepted a glass of orange juice from Catherine and was sipping it slowly, her eyes still fixed on the window. She wasn't looking at the sky anymore. She was looking at her own faint reflection in the glass, a ghostly silhouette against the backdrop of the infinite. And Alistair felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. It was the chilling premonition that this girl's journey had something to do with his own, and that her destination might not just be a place, but a reckoning. The next few hours passed in a strange, suspended reality. Alistair attempted to work. He opened his sleek carbon fiber laptop and brought up the final schematics for the merger. Charts, graphs, projections, the familiar language of his world. Usually he could lose himself in the elegant certainty of the data, the pure logic of profit and loss. But tonight, the numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless squiggles on a screen. His focus was fractured, constantly pulled away by the small, silent figure across the aisle. Alara, for her part, was a model passenger. After finishing her juice, she accepted a warm croissant, which she ate with a slow, methodical precision that suggested a deep and practiced familiarity with hunger. She didn't explore the cabin, didn't touch the myriad of buttons and screens available to her. She simply sat, her backpack a permanent fixture on her lap, and watched the world go by. Catherine had brought her a blanket, a cashmere throw worth more than the girl's entire wardrobe, and she had wrapped it around her shoulders, creating a small, cozy cocoon. Alistair found himself studying her. She was an anomaly, a contradiction. Her clothes were worn, but they were clean. Her hands were smudged with what looked like dirt, but her fingernails were neatly trimmed. There was a wildness to her, but it was tempered by an almost unnerving self-possession. She wasn't fidgety or restless like most children would be. She had the stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time waiting. He called Mark again, this time on his satellite phone, demanding a full report on the catering company. Mark was apoplectic, both at the breach and at his own failure to prevent it. He promised swift and brutal consequences for the responsible parties. "Forget that for now," Alistair said, rubbing the bridge of his nose where a headache was beginning to bloom. "I need you to find out who she is. Her name is Alara. No last name. Run facial recognition, check missing persons reports, cross-reference school registries in a 20-mile radius of the airfield. I want to know everything, who she is, where she came from, and who is missing her." "On it, sir. I'll have a preliminary report within the hour," Mark said, his voice a low growl of contained fury. "What are your instructions for when we land in Zurich?" Alistair hesitated. The logical, efficient answer was to have Swiss authorities meet the plane, take the child into custody, and allow him to proceed to his meeting with minimal delay. It was the correct professional course of action. "We'll proceed as planned," he said, though the words felt hollow. "Have a child services representative on standby. And Mark, be discreet. I don't want this turning into a media circus." "Understood, sir." He hung up and downed the rest of his scotch. The fiery liquid did little to calm the turbulence inside him. He looked over at Alara. She had fallen asleep, her head leaning against the window, her breath fogging a small circle on the cold glass. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder, revealing the strap of her backpack, which she still clutched tightly, even in sleep. What could be in that bag that was so important? Driven by a curiosity that felt like a foreign invasion, Alastair unbuckled his seatbelt and crossed the aisle. He stood over her for a moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She looked so impossibly small, so vulnerable. It would be easy, he thought, to just slip the backpack from her grasp. Find some identification, a clue, anything to solve this irritating puzzle. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, faded canvas. At his touch, her eyes snapped open. They were wide and clear, showing no sign of drowsiness. She didn't scream or startle. She simply looked at his hand on her bag, and then up at his face, her expression unreadable. Alastair pulled his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. He felt a flush of something he hadn't experienced since he was a boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Shame. "I was just going to adjust your blanket," he lied, the words clumsy and obvious. Alara didn't call him on it. She just pulled the blanket back up herself, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she did something that surprised him even more. She unzipped a small outer pocket of her backpack. Her small fingers delved inside and retrieved a book. It was a tattered paperback, the cover soft and creased with use. The title was faded but still legible. An Introduction to the Night Sky. She opened it to a page marked with a folded corner and began to read, her lips moving silently with the words. Alastair returned to his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. That book. He knew that book. A jolt of memory, sharp and painful, shot through him. It was the same book his father had given him for his 10th birthday. A cheap mass-market paperback that had felt like the key to the entire universe. He could almost smell the dusty, comforting scent of the old observatory, feel the cold metal of the telescope against his cheek, hear his father's soft, passionate voice explaining the myths behind the constellations. "That one," his father would say, pointing a long, thin finger into the inky blackness. "That's Lyra, the harp. And that bright one, that's Vega. It's one of the most brilliant stars in our sky. The old stories say that it's the Weaver Girl, forever separated from her lover, the cowherd star, Altair, by the river of the Milky Way." Alastair had loved those stories. He had loved the feeling of being a small boy looking up at something so vast and eternal. He had loved the quiet companionship of his father, a man who had more passion for distant galaxies than for the stock market reports that were already beginning to fascinate Alastair. But as he grew older, the stars began to seem less like magic and more like inefficiently scattered balls of gas. The observatory began to feel less like a gateway to the cosmos, and more like a dilapidated shack on a valuable piece of real estate. His father's passion seemed like a foolish, unprofitable dream. Alastair had chosen a different path. A path paved with gold and concrete. A path that led him as far away from that dusty observatory as possible. He had, in fact, personally signed the demolition order for it 10 years ago to make way for a state-of-the-art corporate research park. Starlight Ridge, he'd called it, a cynical, ironic nod to a past he was determined to erase. The satellite phone buzzed, startling him. It was Mark. "Sir, we have a problem," Mark said, his voice grim. "I've run every search imaginable. Facial recognition came up with nothing. No missing child reports match her description anywhere in the country. We checked school districts, social services, everything. It's like she doesn't exist. She has no digital footprint, no records, nothing. Alistair stared across the aisle at the girl, who was now tracing a diagram of the Big Dipper in her book with her finger. A child with no past. A ghost. "That's not possible, Mark," Alistair said, but even as he said it, a cold knot of dread was tightening in his stomach. "There's more, sir," Mark continued. "The name she gave you. Ilara. It's not a common name. I ran a deep search, cross-referencing it with anything related to your properties, your history. One hit came up. A Dr. Eris Thorne. She was a junior astronomer, a researcher who filed a series of official protests against the demolition of the Starlight Ridge Observatory 10 years ago. She was passionate. Caused a bit of a local stir at the time, but ultimately, she was ignored." Alistair's blood ran cold. He remembered a woman's face from a newspaper clipping his assistant had shown him at the time. Dark hair, intense eyes. A troublemaker. "What does she have to do with this?" Alistair demanded, though he already knew. He could feel the pieces clicking into place, forming a picture he did not want to see. "Dr. Thorne passed away a year ago, sir. Cancer. According to a small local obituary, she was survived by one child, a daughter, named Ilara." The cabin, which had felt so spacious and luxurious moments before, suddenly felt small and suffocating. The air grew thin. Alistair looked at the girl, this impossible child who shouldn't exist but was sitting 10 feet away from him. The daughter of the woman whose career he had casually bulldozed along with her beloved observatory. "Sir?" Mark's voice was a distant buzz in his ear. "Sir, are you there?" Alistair couldn't answer. He was no longer in his private jet. He was standing on a dusty hill on a cold night, a small boy again, listening to his father talk about the Weaver girl star, Vega, in the constellation of Lyra. He looked at the book in Ilara's hands, then at her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the reading light. He finally understood. Her nonsensical destination, the place where you could see the stars best. It wasn't a riddle. It was a memory. It was a specific place on Earth. A place he had destroyed, and her mother wasn't just waiting. She was gone. "Sir, my instructions for Zurich?" Mark pressed, his voice sharp with concern. Alistair looked out the window. The world below was a carpet of darkness, sprinkled with the distant, indifferent lights of cities and towns. Above, the stars were a cold, brilliant fire. He thought of the deal waiting for him in Zurich. Billions of dollars. A legacy of power. It was the culmination of his life's work. It meant everything. And yet... He looked back at Ilara. She had taken a pen from her backpack and was carefully, painstakingly, drawing a new constellation on a blank page in her book. Her tongue was poked out in concentration. She was all alone in the world, chasing a ghost, guided only by a dead mother's promise and a tattered star chart. He thought of the cold glass buildings that now stood on Starlight Ridge, a monument to his own ambition, a tombstone for a woman's dream, a place where no one ever looked up at the sky. "Change of plans, Mark," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "Cancel Zurich." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. "Sir, I don't think I heard you correctly. The closing is in 6 hours. The consortium is waiting. Postponing is not an option. It will kill the deal. The stock will plummet. It will cost." "I am aware of what it will cost," Alistair cut in, his voice gaining a strange, unfamiliar strength. "Find the nearest private airfield to Starlight Ridge. We're changing course." "Sir, with all due respect, that is insane," Mark sputtered. "What do I tell the consortium?" Alistair looked at Alara, who had finished her drawing and was now looking at him, her head tilted, as if she'd been listening all along. He saw in her eyes not just a child, but the ghost of his father, the ghost of the woman who had fought him, the ghost of the boy he himself had been, the boy who had believed in the magic of the stars. "Tell them," Alistair said slowly, a new, terrifying and exhilarating feeling taking root in his chest. "Tell them I had to go see a girl about a star." He ended the call before Mark could protest further. He stood up and walked to the cockpit, his steps sure and steady. The pilots, two ex-Air Force veterans who had seen everything, looked up at him with surprise. "Gentlemen," Alistair said, his voice calm and clear, "we have a new destination." As the magnificent jet began a slow, graceful bank, turning away from the future he had so carefully constructed, and towards a past he had tried so desperately to bury, Alistair returned to his seat. Alara was watching him, her gaze intense. She hadn't asked a single question, but he knew she understood. "Why?" she whispered, the first question she had asked him that wasn't a simple reply. Alistair didn't have a simple answer. He didn't have a logical one. He couldn't explain the tectonic shift that had just occurred deep within him. He couldn't articulate the sudden, overwhelming need to undo something, to fix a wrong that he had never even acknowledged. So he just told her the truth, a truth he was only just beginning to understand himself. "Because," he said, looking not at her, but out the window, at the vast star-dusted darkness that enveloped them. "Because my father loved the stars, too." For the first time since he'd found her, a flicker of something new appeared in Alara's eyes. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was a fragile, hesitant glimmer of something he hadn't seen in another person's eyes in a very long time. It was trust. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned back to the window, as if to make sure the stars were still there, still waiting. And as the plane flew on through the silent, holy night, Alistair Finch, the man who had everything, realized he was on a journey to a place that couldn't be bought, a place he had owned all along but had never known how to find. He was finally going home. The descent was different from the silky smooth arrivals Alistair was accustomed to. Instead of a major international hub, the pilots were navigating towards a small private airfield he'd had built years ago to service the research park. It was a strip of asphalt in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dark rolling hills and whispering pines. As the jet's landing gear locked into place with a solid thud, Alistair felt a jolt that was more than mechanical. It was the jolt of arrival in a place he had actively avoided for a decade. Alara was pressed against the window, her breath once again fogging the glass. Her stillness had been replaced by a quiet, humming anticipation. She was like a compass needle that had finally found its true north. The jet touched down with a gentle screech of tires and taxied to a halt at the edge of the empty tarmac. The engines spooled down, and a profound silence fell over the cabin, a silence that felt heavier and more ancient than the one at 45,000 feet. This was the silence of the earth, of sleeping trees and cold stone. Alistair stood up. "Come on," he said softly. He led the way to the door. Catherine was waiting, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sir, there's a car waiting. Your head of security is very insistent on speaking with you." "He can wait," Alistair said, his eyes on Alara. When the door opened, a wave of cool, damp air washed over them, carrying the scent of pine needles and wet earth. It was a smell from his childhood, a smell he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. It was the smell of Starlight Ridge. Alara took a deep breath, her small chest expanding. She looked out into the pre-dawn darkness, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She stepped out of the plane and onto the metal steps without a moment's hesitation, her small sneakers making soft sounds on the grated steps. Alistair followed. A black SUV was parked a short distance away, its engine rumbling quietly. Alistair ignored it. He walked with Ilara to the edge of the tarmac, where the manicured asphalt gave way to a tangle of wild grass. The moon was a sliver of silver in the sky, and the stars were a breathtaking, chaotic spray of light. Without the light pollution of a city, the Milky Way was a visible, ghostly river arching across the heavens. "It's different," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't remember the road." "There wasn't one," Alistair said, his own voice tight. "The old path was over there." He pointed towards a dark line of trees. It was just a dirt track. He started walking, and she fell into beat on step beside him. They walked in silence, away from the jet and the waiting car, their feet crunching on the gravel at the edge of the woods. The air grew colder as they entered the trees. Alistair's expensive shoes were not made for this kind of terrain, but he barely noticed. He was navigating by memory now, following a ghost of a path that he had walked 1,000 times as a boy. After a few minutes, the trees began to thin, and they emerged onto a rise. And there it was. But it wasn't the place Ilara remembered. It wasn't the place Alistair remembered either. Where the dusty, domed observatory had once stood, a collection of low, sleek buildings now sat, their dark glass walls reflecting the starlight with a cold, dead sheen. It was the Starlight Ridge Corporate Research Park, his creation. A campus of geometric precision and sterile beauty, utterly devoid of soul. A few motion-activated security lights flickered on as they approached, casting long, distorted shadows. Ilara stopped dead. Her small hand, which had unconsciously crept into his, went limp. She stared at the buildings, her face a mask of disbelief. Her lower lip began to tremble. "No," she whispered. "No, this is wrong. It's not here. Where is it?" She looked around wildly, as if expecting the old, familiar dome to materialize from behind one of the corporate monoliths. She turned to him, her eyes wide and accusing. "Where is it? Where is the observatory?" Alistair had faced down hostile takeover bids, government investigations, and corporate spies. He had never felt as defenseless as he did at that moment, standing under the gaze of a heartbroken 9-year-old girl. "It's gone, Ilara," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. I tore it down, a long time ago. To build this." The understanding dawned on her face, slow and agonizing, the hope that had carried her across the country, that had propelled her onto his plane, that had sustained her through whatever hardships she had endured. It crumbled into dust right before his eyes. Her face, which had been so full of fierce determination, just collapsed. A single, perfect tear welled up and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there, silently weeping, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. Her destination, the one place in the universe she believed she could reconnect with her mother, had been erased from the world. And he was the one who held the eraser. This was the speechless moment, the moment of pure, unadulterated loss. She didn't scream at him, didn't rage. Her silence was a far greater condemnation. It was the silence of a promise broken, of a sacred place desecrated. Alistair felt something inside him break. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart, the decades of emotional detachment, they shattered. The pain on that small face was a mirror, reflecting his own buried grief, his own profound loss. He hadn't just torn down a building. He had torn down his own history. He had bulldozed his father's legacy. He had traded wonder for wealth, and he was only now beginning to understand the staggering poverty of that bargain. He knelt in front of her on the damp ground, not caring about the mud staining his trousers. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. She just shook her head, tears falling faster now. She promised, she choked out. She promised she would be waiting. He knew he couldn't fix this. He couldn't rebuild the past. But in that moment, under the vast, silent judgment of the stars, a new, desperate, and utterly insane idea began to form in his mind. An idea that was not about profit or legacy, but about redemption. She is waiting, he said, his voice gaining a sudden, fierce conviction. He took her small, trembling hand in his. You're just looking in the wrong place. Come with me. He stood up, pulling her gently with him. He led her towards the main building, a 4-story structure of glass and steel that housed his own penthouse office suite for when he visited the campus. He swiped his security card, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. They entered a cavernous, marble-floored lobby that was as silent and empty as a tomb. He led her to the elevator and pressed the button for the roof. The elevator ascended in silence, a glass box climbing the side of the building. With each floor, the view of the surrounding hills and the star-dusted sky grew more expansive. When the doors opened, they stepped out onto a rooftop terrace. The wind was stronger up here, cold and clean. Your mother was an astronomer, Alistair said, his voice carrying over the wind. She knew that we are all made of stardust. She knew that light from the stars takes years, sometimes millions of years, to reach us. When we look at the stars, we're not just looking at the present. We're looking into the past. He walked her to the edge of the terrace. He pointed up at the sky, at the brilliant star shining almost directly overhead. That's Vega, he said, his voice softer now. In the constellation Lyra. Your mother isn't in that star, Ilara. She's in the light. Her memory, her love, it's like that starlight. It travels a long way. It might feel like it's gone, but it's still traveling. It's still reaching us. You need the right instrument to see it. Ilara looked from the star to his face, her tears slowing, a question in her eyes. Alistair pulled out his phone. He didn't call Mark. He didn't call his lawyers. He called the head of the research park, a brilliant but perpetually stressed man named Dr. Evans. It was 4 a.m, but Alistair knew he'd be awake. Evans, he said when the man picked up, I need you to open the astrophysics lab, and I need you to bring the portable stellar telescope to the roof of Building A, the Schmidt-Cassegrain. The big one. Now. There was a moment of sputtering confusion on the other end of the line, but Alistair didn't wait for an argument. He hung up. He turned back to Ilara. The sky was beginning to soften in the east, the black turning to a deep, royal blue. They didn't have much time. Within 15 minutes, a team of bewildered scientists, led by a bleary-eyed Dr. Evans, had assembled the telescope on the rooftop. It was a magnificent instrument, a gleaming white tube of technological artistry. Alistair adjusted the dials himself, his fingers surprisingly nimble, his mind dredging up knowledge he hadn't used in 30 years. He calibrated the lens, aimed it at the bright point of Vega, and focused. The image on the small digital screen swam into view, a brilliant, shimmering blue-white jewel, pulsing with ancient light. He turned to Ilara. Look, he said gently. She hesitated, then stepped up to the eyepiece. She peered inside. A soft gasp escaped her lips. The distant, untouchable point of light was transformed into a presence, a living, breathing entity of impossible beauty. She's beautiful, Ilara whispered, her voice filled with awe. Yes, she is, Alistair said, his own eyes burning. He wasn't just looking at a star. He was looking at the nexus of his past, his present, and his future. He put a hand on her small shoulder. She's not gone, Ilara. She's just very, very far away. But she's still shining. And a part of her will always be shining right here, He tapped her chest gently, right over her heart. Ilara looked up at him, and for the first time, a real, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was the most beautiful thing Alastair had ever seen. It was a sunrise after a long, dark night. He stood with her for a long time, on the roof of the building that represented everything he had thought he wanted, and watched as the stars slowly faded into the light of the rising sun. He had lost a $1 billion deal. His company was likely in chaos. His reputation was probably in tatters. But as he stood there, with the warmth of the sun on his face and the small, trusting weight of Ilara's hand in his, he had never felt richer. Later that day, he made another call. This one was to his board of directors. He didn't tell them the whole story. He just told them that the Starlight Ridge Corporate Research Park was being shut down. There was an uproar, of course. Accusations of insanity, threats of lawsuits. He listened to it all calmly. When they had finished, he told them his plan. "We're not just shutting it down," he announced, his voice ringing with a purpose that silenced all opposition. "We're going to build something new. We are going to build the Dr. Aris Thorne Memorial Observatory and Youth Science Center. It will be a place for research, for education, and for wonder. A place where any child who wants to can come and learn about the universe. We're going to build the best place in the world to see the stars." The final image of Alastair Finch's old life was of him standing on that rooftop, a little girl by his side, both of them looking eastward. Not towards the financial capitals of Europe, but towards the dawn of a new day. He hadn't just found a stowaway on his private jet. He had found his own humanity, hiding in plain sight. He had set out on a journey to acquire more of the world, and had ended up finding his own soul, waiting for him in the place where you could see the stars best. His destination had left him speechless, not because of what he found there, but because of what he had almost left behind. He had found a new constellation, not in the sky, but in the small, fierce heart of a girl named Ilara, a guiding star to lead him home.